There was a gentleman.
I think it really is to follow up that question, because I think it's a very important question. In my view, there's no greater special interest group than the legislature itself and those who have come through the system. The system we have is a very difficult and oftentimes a system that doesn't work. But there are people, and many of them are good people, who work their way up through that system and are going to be very reluctant to give up their authority, their history of how this state works. And although I agree completely, Brian, with Steve, with your statements, that this is a key to having a constitutional convention that will really achieve some significant change. I truly wonder, because as I also understand it, the legislature has to appropriate the money for the Constitutional Convention. Constitutional Convention can set the salaries and so forth, but how do you get the money to pay for those salaries? And that's going to have to come from the legislature. And how do you persuade them to authorize the funds for a real Constitutional Convention and at the same time essentially exclude almost everyone from participating in that Constitutional Convention? And I don't know if there's a go part way in this to at least have a modicum of people who have served or are serving in the state government as delegates to the Constitutional Convention. But politically, I just think that that's a very difficult road to hoe.
To break that down, Bob, in two parts. One is it's going to be very difficult to do, absolutely. Certainly this issue will really come to a head in 2017, because that's when it'll be on the ballot. It's going to be on the ballot. The legislature can't do anything to stop that. And also the same thing with funding. The legislature has to fund the Constitutional Convention. If we do have one, they have to fund it. And actually the appropriation for those delegates is the exact same appropriation that a state legislator receives as a state legislator. So they get paid at the same rate. It's just a matter of how long that convention will last. And that's, again, really up to the delegates. But they would call it on an hourly basis. All of the delegates would be paid the exact same thing as a state legislator. And then depending on how long, but once they're done, they're done. But the money has to be appropriated and will be appropriated, but that's not the hard part. The hard part is actually, one, getting the bill passed I mentioned earlier about having elected officials serve two roles. And that's the hard part, but again, there's time between 2016 and 2017 to get that done.
Other questions? Yes, and then,
I think one of the last paragraphs that was up there, we didn't spend much time on, said that labor unions were opposed to having a convention like this, Constitutional Convention. I remember the last time it was on the ballot that happened. Can you speak to that, why labor unions are against it?
Well, I can, but my role here tonight, as I understand it, is, I mean, I've done some of it, not so much to advocate as much as to lay out the way in which, the reasons why we need constitutional reform, even if you don't vote for a constitutional convention. I think one of the things that's interesting about this state, almost everybody knows there needs to be some constitutional reform, even people opposed to the convention. So I would rather not turn it into, I have some very strong arguments about that issue, but that's not my role tonight. I did mention that the strongest in terms of the willingness to spend large amounts of money in 1997 were the public unions. They opposed it. But that's a topic for a different I'm really chomping at the bit to get into it, but it's not, it really, the league asked me to talk about, you know, the arguments about the convention, the process, but it is the major. There are other groups that oppose the convention, and they have legitimate questions. Conservation groups, at least especially, are worried, will this convention take away the forever wild? And there are social welfare groups that are concerned, well, will it take away our welfare clauses? And the ACLU, the NOW, for example, in the state, I remember I have the article, wrote an essay saying that the Constitution will take away the right to abortion. Well, that's just bizarre. But there are other groups that have concerns about particular issues. I mentioned the labor unions because the money to have the TV ads and the powerful phone banks running constantly, thousands and thousands and thousands of calls the last 3 days were funded by the unions. The issue here for me is people need to hear both sides. In 1997, they heard one side, the side of the money. Did you hear one ad on state TV for the convention in 1997? Who spent money on it? I was involved immediately. I was watching every spot to find it. The money wasn't there. What we need to do is not say, look, we're right, but we need to balance that off with arguments about both sides so that voters can make up their mind and not simply be swayed by powerful, somewhat hyperbolic ads. I don't think that answers your question.
So why was this 1997 anyways? If it was 1967, it's supposed to be every 20 years.
I'll explain that. In 1965 and 64, the Supreme Court ruled significant sections of the reapportionment provisions of the New York State Constitution a violation of the federal Constitution. And then the Court of Appeals in New York, in a case called In Re Orans, also held some of those provisions violation of the Constitution. That threw the state legislature into a tizzy. Well, what do? We're unconstitutional now, and the suggestion was made, and it was followed up. The legislature called a constitutional convention to resolve it because they were deadlocked. So the legislature put that question on the ballot in 1965, and it was passed by the voters. And in 67, the convention was held, and a constitution was proposed, but the voters rejected it. So that's not an anomaly, but so the procedure would be 57 would have been the time for a call. The next 20 years would have been 77, which it was called again, and then in 97. So the legislature has the power to call it on its own anytime it wants. And it did so in 1965.
All right, okay, Ricky, and then the gentleman in the back.
The last time they voted on the Constitution, I know you said that it was defeated because it was a thumbs up or thumbs down voting. Who determines whether it's going to be thumbs up, thumbs down, or whether we'll vote on particular items that we accept or don't accept?
In 1967, the president of the convention, a man named Anthony Travia, made a decision, and he convinced his supporters. That was the first convention, by the way, since in the 20th century it was controlled by the Democrats. And by and large, it did some remarkable things. But the one mistake Travia made was to put all of the provisions in one package as a new constitution and say to the voters, take it all or nothing. He believed, I think, hard to figure this out, that there were enough, quote, good things in it that would bring people along to vote yes and swallow some of the things that they had some concerns about. Well, that turned out to be wrong for a lot of reasons. One of which, the Constitution was out there, it was worth it. Democrats hardly spent any time supporting it. Republicans attacked it because it was going to be fiscally costly. The Blade Amendment was taken out, so a lot of people, I didn't believe how significant that issue is for some people. They were about Catholic schools getting money from the state. But that was a hot issue, and a lot of people voted against the Constitution for that reason. So the mistake that was made was to say, take it or leave it. I think if there's a convention in 2017, we've learned our lesson, at least as far as I'm going to try and make it clear we've learned a lesson. You put the non-controversial issues in one omnibus proposal, is what they did in 1938, and then you list the more controversial issues one proposition, and the voters let them pick and choose those. You may not get everything, but you'll get some things, and I trust the voters in an issue like that.
There was a gentleman back here in the back row.
You just answered my question.
Oh, he just answered?
That gentleman in the plaza there, he had first. Wait,
You're right here now.
Yeah, well, he just wanted to, he said his questions there.
I just observe here that the elections or the votes will be taking place in 2017 and 2019. And these are both odd years in which voter turnout is frequently very poor, which means that it's a lot easier for the money structures at B to influence the election. And I think it's unfortunate that it has to be in an odd year with typically low turnout.
I'm afraid that's what the Constitution calls for, though. Not much we can do about it.
Well, it's, a lot of considerations go into that. For example, one of the considerations that people think of at the state level is they don't want certain issues to be decided when there's another election to interfere with or another office. They want it to be one where it is the central issue. So that sometimes is a factor in doing that. On the other hand, as you say, the result might be that there is a depressed turnout. This is a tough issue, and I'm not sure I know how to resolve it.
The gentleman behind you was first, and then I'll come to you next.
I'll save you the trip. I'm glad to see you gentlemen here talking about this. I've been waiting for this for 20 years. I thought it was going to be 16 years. I didn't know it was 20. That's what I was told by somebody, I think. But is there any way that we can get delegates to this thing that are not state legislators, that are not currently involved? It just seems, that was the argument that I had with a couple of legislators. They said that it's really not going to do any good because the same people will be voting anyhow. How do we do that? How do we resolve it? That seems, that is a sticking point, I think, of this whole thing. We definitely need to do this.
Okay, that's one, and I think to save some steps, I'll ask her question too. And then
Okay, well, my question is a little bit different. It has to do with restructuring the judicial article of the Constitution. How controversial is that now? How much power do political leaders still have over the selection of judges? I don't know. I don't really know the answer. That's why I'm asking. Whether it's controversial, the way, any hint of taking away pensions or the social.
I'd be more than happy to answer the question if I can get the mic.
Okay, so we have question one is how do we do a better job of trying to get some ordinary people in there as delegates? And question two is restructuring the judiciary.
I'm going to take a stab at both. First of all, to answer the gentleman's question back, it just takes a piece of legislation to be passed in both houses of the legislature to change who can serve as a delegate. I have a bill, 4674, that currently does that. We're looking for a Senate sponsor in the state Senate that does the exact same thing. My comment to anyone, if you believe that we need to have a ConCon and want to change the delegate process, contact your state legislator, assembly, or Senate, and say, I'd like you to support having a constitutional convention. I want you to support changing how the delegates are selected. It's that simple, and that's what each and every one of you can do by calling your legislator or writing it. To your question about the judiciary, it's very political. And even though now we've got an election coming up in 2 weeks from tomorrow, I believe, and through the 7th judicial district in our region, which I think covers either 8 or 9 counties, there's 4 positions open for state supreme. It doesn't have anything to do with family court or county court. I'm just talking about state supreme court. and you've got candidates on both sides of the aisle running for those 4 open seats. Taking a step backward, it's how those candidates are chosen in each of those parties, which is even more political because it's really a closed process. It's not an open petition process like you have with state legislature. See, I could be preferred by a county committee in the counties I represent, and they could endorse me. But if someone says, hey, I want to run, and I want to run for this seat, they can just circulate petitions. Then you have a primary in the state legislature, and then whoever wins the primary then goes on to face the general election. That process does not exist in the judiciary. And I think if you want to look at trying to open that up, and I think there are a lot of people that want to open it up and that know about it, but the problem is most people have no clue as to how judicial candidates are selected. And I'm not saying any of the judicial candidates are bad people or shouldn't be running. It's the process and the transparency of it. But also judicial candidates, they're bound, they cannot talk about politics. So when they get in front of the room, if they were here tonight seeking your vote, they just say, I'm Brian Kolb, I'm running for state Supreme Court, I've been a lawyer, I've been a judge, and blah, blah, blah. But that's all they can say. They can't say, I want to enact tougher criminal sanctions or longer penalties or no bail. They can't talk about any of those things. So I think that's worth a topic to explore just because it hasn't been looked at in so long.
I'm going to say something about the delegate selection. By the way, we're having these elections in Erie County as well, and I think are we the 8th judicial district, Chris?
8th judicial district, yeah.
And so, absolutely right. You watch the ads for these Supreme Court judges. You're in the kitchen. It's a woman especially, but not necessarily. And she's surrounded with her 3 children. And they're talking about their dad and their mom. And, I mean, it's just, oh, God, I want to just run. But there's a reason why they do that. That's about all they can do. But they got to come up with money. And they got to get that judicial nomination of their Supreme Court judges. And I'm told, I don't know, it's about $100,000 for the job. But the delegate thing, I can't emphasize enough that Senator Cobb's bill may not make it. The legislature may simply say no, but at some point the cycle has to be broken. You have 2 shots in it. One is to have the public say, look, we're not going to vote for you if you run for the delegate. We like you as an assembly. If you want to stay there, we're all happy with you. But we're not going to vote for you if you're in the Senate or the assembly. Enough people have to say that. 2, if you do vote for people like that, you have to think about who among them are the most independent Democrats and independent Republicans who are not simply tied in such a partisan manner to their parties. You have to do that, and you just have to swallow saying, I know that there's a chance here, but if you do that, we'll get better delegates. And even in '67, when we didn't do that, there were some remarkable provisions that came out of that partisan convention, like a really independent redistricting commission. Just for starters. There are a whole series of things that Constitution did that were quite positive. And they were done by all these legislators and judges. So it isn't automatic that if they get in there, they're going to act like the legislature does. I want to reaffirm that.
Yeah, just one other thought based on the delegate question too. It will take some organization and some cooperation, but it seems to me that across this state, in every one of the 63 senatorial districts, one ought to be able to find 3 people who are concerned about having a fair, workable constitution and who have the public stature and integrity to win an election in their state. And if we did a job, if we started right now, looking for delegates, putting together a platform based upon that intent, I think that even if the legislature doesn't accept the Assemblyman's bill. That under the existing rules, a well-coordinated run of delegates that are committed to the kind of thing I think we're all here to talk about tonight, with the publicity behind it, the support behind it, even if they have to form their own political party, could make a big difference in whether there's a critical mass of delegates that can actually carry out the thing that I think we want to do. The time is late, and I think I've been given a signal to cut it off. But I think there was one quick question here.
Thank you. I look around this room and I think that we need to do something to make this relevant to more people than just those of us that are this age. You know, where are the rest of the population? You know, I mean, they're going to be running this country, and I think that we need to do something to get them involved, because this, you know, it's depressing. You know, there's nobody who's younger, much younger than me here. You know.
All right, now thank you all for listening and talking and asking, and I'll turn it over to Mary, who has some things to say.
Thank you very much, Neil. And thank you all for joining us this evening for this important discussion. We're grateful to our excellent panel, Peter Gailey, Brian Kolb, and Neil Jasek. We're grateful to our co-sponsor, the Interfaith Alliance of Rochester, Judy Weinstein, Becky Elwell, Elaine Schmidt, Carol Hoffman, who am I leaving out? It was a fabulous committee that put this together. We thank Asbury First United Methodist Church for the use of their wonderful facilities. Please look for follow-up materials on the table near the doors, along with some information on the League of Women Voters and the Interfaith Alliance. Before you leave, please take time to fill out the evaluation sheets that were left on your chair and place them on the table on your way out. We hope to see you at the First Unitarian Church on Lytton Road South on November 16th, when we present our next forum, Money in Politics, Is Our Democracy for Sale? On this Wednesday, we'll be co-sponsoring a debate among the 3 candidates for county executive with Channel 8. It will be televised live from 7 to 8 on Channel 8. And finally, we ask you to drive safely, and please remember to vote on November 3rd. Thank you again.